Hello and welcome to Top Story. He's bowed to international pressure and ended 8 years of military rule. Pakistani leader Pervez Musharraf has shed his military uniform and become a civilian president, satisfying some of his critics at home and abroad. Stepping down, he said the army would remain in his heart, and the feeling seems to be mutual. His successor, General Ashfaq Parvez Kayani, is a close ally, and Musharraf is likely to keep considerable influence. Are his powers sufficiently diminished to draw opposition parties into an election they've threatened to boycott? And will outside powers re-engage seriously as long as the state of emergency continues? To discuss that, I'm joined now in the studio by Mariam Abu Zahab at the prestigious Institute of Political Studies here in Paris. Thank you very much for being on Top Story. How significant is this event today, the taking of the civilian oath?
Well, it's quite important that now Musharraf has become Mr. Musharraf and not General Musharraf. But now we'll see what's going to happen, because its links with the army are still very close. And General Kayani is very close to him, and Musharraf will rely on him. Because if elections take place, we might be back to the Troika of the 90s, where you have the president and the chief of staff against the prime minister. And so Musharraf might need to have the support of the army in case he has problems dealing with the prime minister.
And presumably Kayani will not make moves that would go against Musharraf. Is that the general idea?
That's the general idea. As long as Musharraf is not seen by the army as a liability, this can go on for a long time.
What are the differences now, I mean, in his actual powers, Musharraf's powers, as opposed to when he was army chief? Is there a big difference now?
There is a difference to some extent, but now that he is president, he can end the state of emergency because of the changes he did in the few amendments before he took oath as a president. So as long as state of emergency is not lifted, he still has much power.
Will he end that state of emergency before the elections, in your view?
There are rumors that state of emergency might be lifted very soon, and it's very important for the elections to have some degree of credibility, because elections under state of emergency would have no credibility at all, particularly in the West.
And what is the West saying at the moment about how this change will affect the future of Pakistan?
This is a good step, but it's only a first step, and it should do more. Elections should be free and fair, which they will not be. There have never been free and fair elections in Pakistan, except perhaps in 1970. So it's only a first step. So it will be under pressure from the West, particularly the US, to lift the state of emergency as soon as possible.
But presumably the West will have to go softly on democracy now, because things do seem to be stabilizing, and they don't want to alienate Kayani either, who's an ally in the war on terror.
Yeah, the US cannot afford to alienate the Pakistani army. They need them for as long as they are in Afghanistan, because without Pakistan they have no access to Afghanistan and supply for the troops and all that. And so the US is more interested in stability than in elections. But, you know, Bush has to show that at least in Pakistan democracy works, and so elections will take place.
Well, let's talk a bit more about those elections. What is the opposition saying at the moment about this new civilian president? Has that affected relations?
Well, most of the parties say it doesn't change anything, because we don't want Musharraf at all, whether in uniform or without uniform. So they are still saying, "Go Musharraf, go." The slogan is still there. But it seems that Benazir Bhutto said that after much hesitation, which she said that she's taking part, which is not at all a surprise. We knew all the time that she would never boycott the elections, because she wanted to be prime minister for a short time. And the deal is still there. And even when she was openly confronting Musharraf, there were still, negotiations going on through intermediaries, because none of them could lose face. And so now she has said, I will take part in the elections. And Nawaz Sharif doesn't want to have any dealings with Musharraf. He doesn't want to participate in elections when Musharraf is a president. And so he's trying to convince Benazir to boycott the elections. And most of the opposition parties want to boycott, which might not be a good idea. idea, because if you boycott the elections, you're marginalized. And the parties are not in a position to mobilize the people for boycott.
Well, the problem is surely that if some parties take part, then the election has some legitimacy. But if everybody can boycott it, then Musharraf is in real trouble.
Yeah, and they won't boycott. And even like in 1985, when the PPP asked people to boycott, and you had over
Benazir Bhutto's party, that is.
Yeah, and that day it was elections before the lifting of martial law in 1985. So candidates were independent officially, and the PPP called for boycott of the elections, and there were 50 to 60 MPs who preferred to be expelled from the PPP, but to be elected and to sit in the assembly. And you found them in the PPP ticket in the next elections in '88. So this might very well be the case again. And, there are 13,000 nominations already. And for some seats, it's 40 to 50 people who are competing, and there's very, very strong competition. So, the parties, even if they call for boycott, the people won't boycott the elections.
Isn't this really the biggest problem is facing Nawaz Sharif, because he detests Benazir Bhutto's politics as much as he does Musharraf's, arguably?
Yeah, and anyway, Benazir, she's seen by Nawaz Sharif as a traitor, because they signed the Charter of Democracy in London, and they say that never they would have any dealing with the military regime. And Benazir immediately started negotiating with Musharraf. So they just hate each other. But now they have to understand that if they want to face Musharraf, they have to go, together. And what's going to happen, what might happen, is that we'll have a hung parliament, because if in Punjab, the PPP, Nawaz Sharif, who has a strong vote base in Punjab, and what's left of the PML, the Muslim League, supporting Musharraf, which is now disintegrating, then you will have splitting of votes, and which means a hung parliament, which would be the best scenario for Musharraf.
And what would happen then, just briefly, if he has a hung parliament?
You need a coalition government, which is unstable by nature. And so it means that nobody will get a real majority, and so Musharraf can manipulate it very easily.
Manipulate the Prime Minister in the old Troika
scenario,
and work with General Kayani.
Back again, and that's what Benazir Bhutto is heading to at the moment.
Right, okay. Well, I think we'll have to leave it there for this particular edition, but thank you very much for joining us. That was Mariam Abu Zahab from the prestigious Institute of Political Studies here in Paris. Do join us again at the same time tomorrow for another edition of Top Story. Stay tuned to France 24.